The clinking of crystal champagne flutes stopped dead. Laughter died in the throats of London's most elite socialites. A moment ago, they were ruthlessly tearing apart Josephine's faded, seemingly unbranded gown, relegating her to a cramped, dusty table near the swinging kitchen doors of the Grand Sovereign Gala. They called her a beggar, a pathetic stain on their highly exclusive evening, but the sneers froze on their perfectly contoured faces when the massive gilded doors blew open. Not one, not 10, but 60 elite royal guards in full ceremonial dress marched in perfect synchronization, their boots shaking the marble floor, heading straight for the girl in the cheap dress. The rain battered against the fogged windows of a tiny drafty flat in the heart of London's less glamorous outskirts. Josephine sat at her cramped wooden kitchen table, staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope resting under the flickering yellow light of a single bulb. The paper was heavy, expensive, and sealed with a crimson wax stamp bearing the crest of the House of Castile, a European royal family known for their staggering wealth and impenetrable exclusivity. Josephine carefully ran her thumb over the gold-embossed lettering of the invitation. It invited her, simply Miss Josephine Harrington, to the Grand Sovereign Gala at the historic Wellington House. It was the social event of the decade, a gathering so elite that billionaires and A-list celebrities were routinely turned away. For Josephine, a 24-year-old antique book restorer who spent her days inhaling dust and her nights counting pennies to keep the heat on, the invitation felt like a cruel joke. They must have sent it to the wrong Harrington, a sharp, nasal voice sneered from the doorway. Josephine didn't need to look up to know it was Chloe Wentworth, her landlord's daughter, and a minor socialite who delighted in reminding Josephine of her place in the world. Chloe stepped into the small flat uninvited, shaking her dripping designer umbrella onto Josephine's threadbare rug. She was draped in a tailored cashmere coat, her sharp features set in a permanent expression of disdain. "I highly doubt a royal courier makes mistakes, Chloe," Josephine replied quietly, carefully slipping the invitation back into its pristine envelope. Chloe let out a high, grating laugh. "Oh, please, the Grand Sovereign Gala? My mother, Lady Eleanor, had to call in 3 separate favors just to get us a table near the balcony. And you think they invited a shop girl? What on earth are you going to wear? That dreadful gray cardigan you wear to the bakery?" Josephine's eyes drifted toward the open closet door in her bedroom. Hanging from a padded velvet hanger was a dress. It was an antique, handed down through 3 generations of Harrington women. Once, before her grandfather's catastrophic financial ruin left the family completely destitute, the Harringtons had been someone. Now, all Josephine had left of her family's legacy was a tarnished silver locket and that dress. It was a deep, muted emerald green, made of a fabric that lacked the obnoxious synthetic shine of modern couture. To the untrained eye, to someone like Chloe, it looked dull, shapeless, and utterly unremarkable. There were no designer logos, no gaudy sequins, no plunging necklines. It was a vintage 1920s original, hand-stitched by a master couturier in Paris, but time had softened its impact. "I have a dress," Josephine said, lifting her chin. Chloe followed her gaze. She walked over to the closet, reached out with a manicured hand, and rubbed the fabric between her fingers. A smirk played on her lips. "This, Josephine, it looks like a curtain from a dilapidated nursing home. It doesn't even have a label. If you wear this to Wellington House, security will throw you out before you even reach the coat check. You'll be the laughingstock of London." "It belonged to my grandmother," Josephine said, her voice tightening. She stepped forward, gently pulling the fabric out of Chloe's grasp. "It has more history than anything you've ever bought off a runway." "History doesn't get you past the velvet rope, darling," Chloe mocked, turning on her heel. "Money does. I'll see you tonight, then. Try not to spill soup on yourself when they stick you in the staff quarters." As the door clicked shut behind Chloe, Josephine let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked at the dress again. Chloe's words stung, mostly because Josephine feared they were true. The elite of London were a vicious, bloodthirsty crowd. They fed on weakness and judged entirely on appearances, but the invitation had her name on it. And more importantly, there was a handwritten note tucked inside the envelope, written in a sharp, elegant scrawl she hadn't seen in 4 years. "Wear the green. I'll be waiting. Angelo." Angelo. The name alone sent a jolt of electricity through her chest. 4 years ago, he was just an exchange student at Oxford, a charming, quiet boy who spent hours in the library where Josephine worked. They had fallen deeply, quietly in love over dog-eared pages of poetry and cheap cups of coffee. It wasn't until his sudden, violent extraction from the university by armed guards that she learned the truth. He wasn't Angelo, the literature student. He was Crown Prince Angelo of Castile. She hadn't heard from him since, until today. Josephine touched the green fabric of the dress. She didn't care about the gala. She didn't care about the billionaires, the socialites, or the Wentworths. She just wanted to see him one last time. Taking a deep breath, she began to get ready. She pulled her dark hair into a simple, elegant chignon, applied a touch of red lipstick, and slipped the vintage gown over her shoulders. The fabric settled perfectly against her frame, a ghost of a bygone era. She looked in the mirror. She didn't look rich. She didn't look royal. She looked entirely out of place. But she stood tall, grabbed her small clutch, and headed out into the London rain. Wellington House was a spectacle of blinding light and dripping wealth. As Josephine's modest, hired cab pulled up to the end of the long driveway, the driver whistled under his breath. "Right, miss. This is as far as they'll let me go. The rest of the drive is reserved for the limousines." "This is fine, thank you," Josephine said, handing him a crumpled 20-pound note. "Body." She stepped out into the crisp evening air. Ahead of her, a parade of Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and Maybachs slowly crawled toward the grand colonnaded entrance. Flashbulbs from 100 paparazzi exploded in rapid succession, illuminating the night like lightning strikes. Women draped in thousands of dollars of silk and diamonds stepped onto the plush crimson carpet, smiling fiercely for the cameras. Men in bespoke tuxedos adjusted their diamond cufflinks. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and raw, unadulterated power. Josephine kept her head down, walking along the edge of the driveway to avoid the flashing cameras. Her vintage green dress brushed against her ankles, the soft fabric whispering against the damp pavement. She reached the grand stone steps and queued up behind a group of boisterous, sharply dressed heirs. "Invitations, please," a stern voice barked. At the top of the stairs stood the head of security, a mountain of a man in a black suit, flanked by 4 guards. He was ruthlessly efficient, turning away a furious-looking man who had apparently brought the wrong credentials. When it was Josephine's turn, she stepped forward and handed over her envelope. The head of security barely looked at her at first. But as his eyes scanned her simple, unbranded dress, his brow furrowed. He looked at the heavy gold-embossed envelope, then back at her. His gaze was sweeping and judgmental, taking in her lack of jewelry and the faded, muted tone of her gown. "Name?" he asked sharply, his tone dropping an octave. "Josephine Harrington," she said, keeping her voice steady. He opened the envelope, pulled out the card, and ran a finger over the royal seal. He squinted at it, holding it up to the light as if checking for a forgery. A few guests behind Josephine began to sigh loudly in impatience. "Is there a problem?" a haughty voice called out from the crowd. Josephine turned. Standing a few paces away was Lady Eleanor Kensington, accompanied by her daughter, Beatrice. They were dripping in fresh off-the-runway Givenchy and Cartier diamonds. Lady Eleanor stepped forward, her eyes sweeping over Josephine with unabashed disgust. "Security," Lady Eleanor said loudly, ensuring everyone in the foyer could hear her. "Why is the line being held up by a pedestrian? Did she wander in from the street, seeking shelter from the rain?" A ripple of cruel laughter echoed through the grand entrance hall. Beatrice covered her mouth, her eyes glinting with malice. "Mother, look at her dress. It looks like it was salvaged from a charity bin. Goodness, it doesn't even have a shape." Josephine's cheeks burned. She clenched her fists at her sides. "I have an invitation," she said to the guard, ignoring the Kensington women. The head of security frowned, checking a heavy leather-bound ledger on his podium. He dragged a thick finger down the page. Harrington, he paused. "Ah, here it is, table 89. He snapped the book shut and handed her the invitation back, his face devoid of respect. Through the doors. "Keep to the right." As Josephine walked past the security checkpoint, she heard Lady Eleanor muttering loudly to her daughter. "Table 89? That's practically in the scullery. I suppose the organizers had to invite a few charity cases for tax purposes. Keep your purse close, Beatrice." The interior of Wellington House was breathtaking. The grand foyer featured a sweeping marble staircase, walls adorned with Renaissance masterpieces, and a chandelier so massive it looked like a cluster of captured stars. Waiters in white gloves glided through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. But the beauty of the room was entirely overshadowed by the venom of its occupants. As Josephine made her way through the glittering crowd toward the main ballroom, she became painfully aware of the stairs. High society is a small, vicious village. Everyone knows everyone, and they instantly recognize an outsider. Eyes dragged over her vintage green dress, whispers ignited like dry brush. "Who is that? Is she lost? Look at the fabric, it's positively ancient, and not in a chic way. I heard she works in a dusty bookshop. Disgusting." Suddenly, a heavy shoulder slammed into Josephine's side. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing on the polished marble floor. A sharp gasp followed, and Josephine looked up to see Chloe Wentworth standing there, holding an empty martini glass. A dark, ugly stain of red wine was currently dripping down the front of Chloe's companion's white tuxedo jacket. "Oh my God!" Chloe shrieked, though her eyes danced with triumph. "You clumsy idiot! Do you have any idea how much this jacket costs?" The man beside her, a notoriously wealthy hedge fund heir named Harrison Cole, looked down at his ruined jacket with venomous rage. He glared at Josephine as if she were an insect he wanted to crush. "Are you blind?" he spat. "Or just too stupid to walk in a straight line?" "I didn't bump into you," Josephine said, her voice trembling slightly but holding its ground. "Chloe pushed into me." "Liar," Chloe gasped, clutching her chest in mock horror. "Harrison, this girl is unhinged. She's a squatter from Chelsea. I have no idea how she snuck in here, but look at her. She looks like a vagrant." A crowd had formed around them now, a perfect circle of London's elite, trapping Josephine in the center. The glittering diamonds, the harsh, mocking faces, the sneers of disgust. It was suffocating. She searched the room desperately, looking for Angelo, looking for any friendly face, but she was entirely alone in a sea of wolves. "Someone fetched the floor manager," Harrison snapped, snapping his fingers at a passing waiter. "I want this trash removed from the premises immediately." The grand ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence, designed to seat 500 of the world's most powerful people. The ceiling was painted with sprawling frescoes of mythological battles, and the tables were draped in silk linens, adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and dripping crystals. At the very front of the room, elevated on a tiered platform and roped off by thick crimson velvet, was the royal table. It was currently empty, awaiting the arrival of the sovereign guests. The plates on the royal table were solid gold, the crystal glasses etched with the crest of Castile. Josephine, however, was nowhere near it. After the incident in the foyer, The floor manager had swooped in. Rather than throwing her out, since her name was technically on the master list, he had forcefully ushered her away from the elite crowd, practically hiding her in the shadows. Table 89 was an insult disguised as a seat. It was shoved into a dark alcove at the absolute back of the room, directly next to the heavy swinging doors that led to the kitchen. The draft from the service hallway was freezing, and the constant clattering of pots and shouting of chefs completely drowned out the soft string quartet playing at the front of the room. Josephine sat alone. The other seats at table 89 remained empty, clearly reserved for no-shows or perhaps staff who were on break. She smoothed down the fabric of her grandmother's dress, her hands shaking slightly. The dampness from her walk in the rain was chilling her to the bone, and the hostile glares from the neighboring tables felt like physical blows. At table 88, just a few feet away, sat Chloe Wentworth, Lady Eleanor, Beatrice, and Harrison Cole. They had apparently requested to be moved to a better vantage point, which conveniently allowed them to observe and torment Josephine. "I still can't believe they let her stay," Harrison said loudly, not bothering to lower his voice over the din of the room. He was wearing a backup jacket provided by the hotel, but his ego was still bruised. "It lowers the prestige of the entire evening. A girl in a rag sitting at the gala. Next year they'll be inviting the chimney sweeps." "Look at her," Beatrice giggled, pointing a manicured finger. "She's shaking, probably hasn't eaten in days. Do you think she'll try to stuff the silverware into her cheap little purse?" "I'd check her at the door," Lady Eleanor added, sipping her champagne. "People like that have sticky fingers and terrible taste. That green monstrosity she's wearing offends my eyes." Josephine stared straight ahead at the empty gold plates on the distant royal table. She tried to block out their voices. She repeated Angelo's note in her head over and over. "Wear the green, I'll be waiting." But where was he? The dinner service was about to begin. The room was packed. The doors at the front remained closed. Had it been a cruel prank? Had Angelo even sent the invitation? Or was this some elaborate scheme, engineered by Chloe to humiliate her on the grandest scale possible? Doubt began to gnaw at her stomach, thick and cold. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her small table. Josephine looked up to see a woman standing over her. It was Lady Fiona Sterling, an infamous socialite known for her ruthless gossip column and terrifying influence over London's society. She was dressed in a spectacular silver gown that caught the light like shattered glass. "You," Lady Fiona said, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't know who you slept with or who you blackmailed to get your name on that list, but you are ruining my line of sight to the royal table." "I'm sitting where I was told to sit," Josephine replied softly, keeping her chin level. Lady Fiona scoffed, leaning in closer. "Listen to me, you little street rat. We all know you don't belong here. You are an embarrassment. Your dress is an insult to the designers who worked for months to dress the women in this room. You are a dirty, insignificant speck, and I am going to have security drag you out through the service elevator before the appetizers are served." Lady Fiona snapped her fingers high in the air. Immediately, the head of security, the same burly man from the front door, marched over, followed closely by the event organizer, a nervous-looking man holding a clipboard. "Remove her," Lady Fiona ordered, pointing a sharp, diamond-ringed finger at Josephine's face. "She is disturbing the guests. Harrison Cole has already filed a formal complaint of assault, and I am filing a complaint of sheer aesthetic offense." The event organizer wiped sweat from his brow. He looked at Josephine's simple green dress, and then at the furious, powerful billionaires surrounding her table. In his world, the math was simple. You do not upset the billionaires for the sake of a nobody. "Miss," the organizer said coldly, stepping toward Josephine, "I'm afraid I must ask you to leave the premises immediately. Your presence here is causing a disruption." "I have an invitation," Josephine said, standing up. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, panic rising in her throat. The entire back half of the ballroom had fallen silent, watching the spectacle with greedy, delighted eyes. Chloe Wentworth was literally recording the moment on her phone, a vicious smile plastered on her face. "Invitations can be revoked," the head of security growled, stepping into her personal space. He reached out and grabbed Josephine roughly by the upper arm. His grip was bruising, pulling her out of her chair. "Take your hands off me," Josephine demanded, trying to yank her arm away, but he was too strong. "Stop making a scene, you pathetic beggar," Lady Eleanor hissed from the next table. "Just leave through the kitchen like the trash you are." "Drag her out," someone shouted from the crowd. "Call the police," another added. The security guard yanked her forward, pulling her toward the swinging kitchen doors. Josephine stumbled, her antique green dress catching the edge of a chair. Tears of pure humiliation burned in her eyes. It was over. It was a joke. Angela wasn't here. She was just a poor girl in a forgotten dress, about to be thrown into the rainy alleyway like garbage while the richest people in the world laughed at her. The guard reached for the handle of the kitchen doors, and then a sound echoed through the massive ballroom that made the blood freeze in everyone's veins. Boom! The heavy, 12-foot-tall mahogany doors at the main entrance of the ballroom didn't just open. They were violently thrown wide open, the brass handles slamming against the marble walls with the force of a gunshot. The string quartet stopped playing instantly with a horrific screech of a bow. The murmurs, the laughter, the sneers of the elite crowd, they all evaporated into a dead, terrified silence. The floor manager froze. The security guard holding Josephine's arm stopped dead in his tracks, his head whipping toward the front of the room. The deafening crash of the heavy mahogany doors rebounding off the marble walls was followed by a sound that London's elite were entirely unaccustomed to hearing: the synchronized, earth-shaking thud of military boots. Through the grand entrance marched the vanguard of the Castilian Royal Guard. They did not stroll. They did not mingle. They moved with the terrifying, flawless precision of an apex predator. There were exactly 60 of them, moving in a perfect, impenetrable rectangular phalanx. They were clad in their ceremonial obsidian blue tunics, adorned with heavy, braided gold epaulets that caught the light of the massive chandeliers. At their hips rested ceremonial steel broadswords, and their faces were set in expressions of absolute, unyielding stone. The string quartet's screeching halt left a vacuum of silence in the grand ballroom, instantly filled by the militant crack, crack, crack of 240 boot heels striking the polished floor in perfect unison. Panic, swift and icy, swept through the room. Billionaires who were accustomed to snapping their fingers to make the world bend to their will suddenly found themselves shrinking back against their tables. Celebrities who thrived on attention instinctively raised their hands to shield their faces. The sheer, overwhelming aura of genuine ancient power radiated from the soldiers, making the wealth in the room feel instantly cheap and fragile. Lady Eleanor Kensington spilled her vintage Dom Perignon directly down the front of her Givenchy gown and didn't even notice. Harrison Cole, the arrogant hedge fund heir who had moments ago demanded Josephine's removal, stood frozen, the color draining entirely from his sharply contoured face. The guards did not head for the velvet-roped royal table at the front of the room. Instead, they pivoted sharply, their boots pivoting on the marble with a sharp hiss, and marched straight down the center aisle. They were heading directly for the dark, drafty alcove at the back of the room. They were heading for table 89. At the helm of the formation strode Captain Montgomery Hayes, a decorated veteran whose chest was heavy with medals of valor. His piercing gray eyes were locked onto a single target, the massive, sweating head of security, whose thick hand was still clamped aggressively around Josephine's upper arm. As the phalanx approached, the wealthy patrons sitting in the back rows scrambled violently out of their chairs, desperate to get out of the way. Chloe Wentworth stumbled backward, her heel catching on the hem of her own designer dress, sending her crashing into a tray of caviar. She didn't dare make a sound, "Halt!" Captain Hayes barked. The command echoed off the frescoed ceiling. 60 soldiers stopped dead. The silence that followed was so profound that Josephine could hear the rapid, terrified breathing of the event organizer standing a few feet away. Captain Hayes stepped forward, closing the distance between the military formation and the pathetic scene unfolding by the kitchen doors. He looked at the event organizer, then at Lady Fiona Sterling, and finally, his gaze dropped to the security guard's hand, which was still gripping Josephine. "Remove your hand from her," Captain Hayes said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal, freezing authority that made the hairs on the back of Josephine's neck stand up. "If you do not release her in the next 2 seconds, I will have my men sever it from your wrist." The head of security let out a pathetic, strangled gasp. He snatched his hand back, as if Josephine's skin had suddenly turned to molten lava, stumbling backward until his broad shoulders hit the swinging kitchen doors. "Oi, what is the meaning of this?" the event organizer stammered, his clipboard shaking violently against his chest. We were just handling a disturbance. This woman—" "You were handling nothing," Captain Hayes interrupted, his voice dripping with aristocratic disdain. He turned his steely gaze toward Lady Fiona Sterling, who was standing frozen in her shimmering silver gown. "And you, madam, I overheard your demand to have this guest removed." Lady Fiona swallowed hard, her usual venomous confidence completely evaporating under the terrifying glare of the royal guard. She tried to puff out her chest, leaning on her societal status. She was causing a scene. Look at her. She's dressed in rags. She doesn't belong here with us. Captain Hayes let out a sharp, humorless laugh that cut through the tension like a blade. "Dressed in rags? Do you have absolutely no education, or are you simply blind?" He stepped past the trembling socialites and approached Josephine. The fierce, terrifying demeanor melted from his face, replaced instantly by an expression of profound, undeniable reverence. He stopped 2 paces from her, clicked his heels together, and bowed deeply from the waist. A bow reserved only for royalty and heads of state. Behind him, all 60 royal guards drew their swords in a singular, ringing sheen of polished steel and dropped to one knee. The collective gasp from the 500 elite guests in the ballroom sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. Beatrice Kensington openly swayed, clutching her mother's arm to keep from fainting. Chloe Wentworth's mouth hung open in an ugly, slack-jawed expression of pure horror. "Miss Josephine Harrington," Captain Hayes said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent, shell-shocked room. "On behalf of His Royal Highness Crown Prince Angelo of Castile, I offer my deepest apologies for our delayed arrival and for the utterly unacceptable treatment you have endured at the hands of these peasants." Peasants. The word hit the billionaires and aristocrats like a physical slap across the face. Harrison Cole's jaw tightened, but he didn't dare speak. To the Castilian royal guard, old money or new money made no difference. Without a crown, they were all commoners. Josephine stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked down at Captain Hayes, then at the sea of kneeling soldiers. He actually sent you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of overwhelming relief and disbelief. "He did, my lady," Hayes replied softly, standing upright. "He has been waiting for you." The event organizer, desperate to salvage his career and his life, took a hesitant step forward. "Captain Hayes, please, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. We were simply unaware of Miss Harrington's status. Her attire, you must admit, lacks the standard designer." "Silence, you ignorant fool," Captain Hayes snapped, his eyes flashing with raw fury. He turned slowly, sweeping his gaze across the terrified faces of Lady Fiona, Chloe Wentworth, and the Kensington women. He gestured sharply toward Josephine. "You mock her dress because you lack the sophistication to recognize history when it stands before you." The captain projected his voice, ensuring every mocking guest in the room heard his words. This is not a rag. This is an original 1926 Madeleine Vionnet, bias-cut gown, spun from a proprietary emerald silk weave that has been lost to time. It was commissioned specifically by Her Majesty, Queen Victoria of Castile, as a gift to Lady Genevieve Harrington. A shock wave rippled through the older, more educated members of the elite crowd. Whispers broke out like wildfire. A Vionnet? The lost Emerald Vionnet? It can't be. My God, fashion historians have been searching for that piece for decades. It belongs in the Louvre. Chloe Wentworth turned a sickly shade of gray. The nursing home curtain she had mercilessly ridiculed earlier that evening was literally a museum-grade historical artifact, worth more than her family's entire estate. Captain Hayes wasn't finished. During the siege of 1941, when the Castilian royal family was forced into hiding, it was Lady Genevieve Harrington who smuggled the crown jewels out of the country, risking her own life to protect the sovereignty of our nation. The Harringtons are not just guests of the crown. They are the sworn protectors of the House of Castile. And this dress, he pointed to the muted green fabric that suddenly seemed to glow with unspoken majesty, is the symbol of that eternal bond. To insult this gown is to insult the crown itself. Lady Eleanor Kensington let out a soft whimper. She had loudly and publicly demanded the wearer of that dress be thrown out with the trash. Lady Fiona looked as though she might vomit. The hierarchy of their little aristocratic world had just been completely, violently upended. You, Captain Hayes pointed a gloved finger at the head of security. Pack your belongings. You will never work in a civilized establishment again. He then turned his attention to Chloe Wentworth, whose eyes were wide with rising terror. And you, Miss Wentworth, I saw the security footage from the foyer. You purposefully assaulted an honored guest of the crown, ruining Mr. Cole's jacket to frame her. The authorities will be waiting for you outside to discuss charges of fraud and harassment. No, Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking in desperation. It was a joke. It was just a misunderstanding. Josephine, tell him. Josephine looked at Chloe, the girl who had made her life a living hell, who had mocked her poverty, who had tried to have her thrown into the rainy streets like an animal. Josephine felt the soft, ancient silk of her grandmother's dress against her fingertips. She stood perfectly straight, her posture mirroring the forgotten aristocratic grace of her ancestors. I don't believe we have anything to discuss, Chloe, Josephine said, her voice completely steady, ringing with quiet, absolute power. Chloe burst into humiliating, hysterical tears as two massive royal guards stepped out of formation and flanked her, forcefully grabbing her by the elbows to escort her out of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, turning their faces away in disgust, instantly abandoning the girl they had been laughing with only 10 minutes prior. Captain Hayes turned back to Josephine, his expression softening entirely. He offered her his white-gloved arm. Miss Harrington, he said gently, Table 89 is entirely unacceptable for a woman of your station. The Crown Prince has requested your presence at the royal table. Shall we? Josephine looked at the offered arm. The crushing weight of the evening's humiliation evaporated, replaced by a soaring, breathless exhilaration. Atom. Angelo had not forgotten her. He had not abandoned her. He had orchestrated this entire evening to pull her out of the shadows and place her exactly where she belonged. We shall, Captain, Josephine smiled, placing her hand lightly on his arm. Guard, form up, Hayes roared. Instantly, the remaining 58 elite soldiers shifted. They created a double-walled corridor of steel and obsidian blue, forming an impenetrable path of honor straight down the center of the grand ballroom. As Josephine walked, the soldiers moved with her, a rolling phalanx of protection. The music had long since stopped. The only sound in the cavernous room was the slow, deliberate march of the vanguard and the soft rustle of the 1926 Emerald Vionnet. She passed the Kensington table. Lady Eleanor and Beatrice were staring at their plates, their faces flushed bright red with shame, terrified to even make eye contact. She passed Harrison Cole, who was gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were white, utterly emasculated by the sheer display of force. She passed Lady Fiona, who had sunk into her chair, her reputation as the queen of high society completely shattered by a single public dressing down from a royal captain. Every sneer, every laugh, every cruel whisper that had haunted Josephine since she arrived was ground as a sit to the marble beneath the boots of the Castilian guard. They reached the front of the room, stepping past the thick crimson velvet ropes that separated the billionaires from the true sovereigns. The royal table was draped in gold-threaded silk, bathed in the warm light of a private chandelier, and standing at the head of the table, his eyes locked onto hers with the same quiet, intense adoration he had shown her in a dusty Oxford library 4 years ago, was Crown Prince Angelo. He wore a tailored midnight blue tuxedo, but the formal attire couldn't hide the boyish, relieved smile that broke across his face as she approached. He didn't wait for her to reach her seat. Breaking all protocols of royal decorum, Angelo stepped away from the head of the table, bypassed the waiting waiters, and walked down the steps of the platform to meet her halfway. Angelo stopped just inches from Josephine. For a long, suspended moment, the rest of the world, the cavernous ballroom, the trembling billionaires, the rigid ranks of the vanguard, simply ceased to exist. He reached out, his hands trembling slightly, and gently took hers. His thumbs brushed over her knuckles, feeling the calluses she had earned from years of scraping by, restoring old books in a drafty shop. A flicker of profound sorrow crossed his eyes, swiftly replaced by an unyielding resolve. "You wore the green," Angelo whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at the antique Viennette silk, reverence shining in his gaze. "You have no idea how beautiful you look, Josephine. You eclipse every diamond in this room." "Angelo," she breathed, the name tasting like a prayer she had been denied for 4 years. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back, refusing to cry in front of the audience that had just tried to destroy her. "You left. 4 years ago you just vanished into thin air. No letter, no call." "I know," he said softly, stepping closer, closing the distance so his voice was meant only for her. "And it is the greatest regret of my life. But if I had contacted you, if I had shown even a fraction of the love I hold for you, you would be dead." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Angelo gently guided her up the carpeted steps toward the royal table. He pulled out her heavy gold-leafed chair himself, an act of servitude that made the remaining aristocrats in the room clutch their pearls in collective shock. He waited until she was seated, then took his own place at the head of the table. Captain Hayes stood directly behind Angelo's right shoulder, a silent sentinel of impending doom for the rest of the room. 4 years ago, on the day I was taken from Oxford, Angelo began, his voice low and steady, my father, King Henrik, was poisoned. It was a highly coordinated coup, engineered by a faction within our own parliament, funded by foreign interests who wanted to drain the Castilian sovereign fund. The men who came for me weren't just bringing me home. They were extracting me because assassins were already en route to my dormitory. Josephine felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the damp London evening. She looked at the man she had loved as a quiet poetry student, suddenly seeing the hardened, battle-tested monarch he had been forced to become. "I spent the last 4 years fighting a shadow war in the dark," Angelo continued, pouring her a glass of water from a crystal carafe. "I had to purge the traitors from my government, secure the borders, and dismantle the financial networks that funded the coup. If my enemies had known about you, Josephine, they would have used you to break me. I had to erase every trace of my time in London. I had to let you believe I abandoned you." He reached across the silk tablecloth and placed his hand over hers. "Every day I thought of you. I had operatives watching your flat, your bookshop, keeping you safe from a distance. But I couldn't intervene. I couldn't pay your bills or move you to a better home, because any sudden influx of wealth would have flagged you to the cartel. Josephine's mind raced. The grueling double shifts at the bindery, the freezing winters where she wore 3 sweaters to bed, the constant grinding anxiety of poverty. It hadn't just been bad luck. It had been a protective camouflage. "Then why tonight?" she asked, her voice steadying as the pieces clicked into place. "Why the invitation? Why risk bringing me into the center of London society?" Angelo's eyes darkened, turning the color of a stormy sea. He looked out over the ballroom, where 500 of the world's wealthiest people were currently sitting in terrified, agonizing silence. Nobody was eating. Nobody was speaking. They were simply waiting for the guillotine to fall. "Because the war in Castile is over," Angelo said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I won. But the war in London, that ends tonight. And I needed you to be here, wearing the Harrington green, so the world knows exactly who stands under the absolute protection of the crown." Angelo gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to Captain Hayes. The captain stepped forward to the edge of the royal platform. He raised a silver whistle to his lips and blew a single, piercing note. Immediately, the heavy wooden doors to the kitchens, the service elevators, and the grand balconies burst open. Dozens more royal guards poured into the room alongside heavily armed officers of the London Metropolitan Police's Financial Crimes Unit. They swiftly and silently secured every exit. The Grand Sovereign Gala was no longer a dinner party. It was a steel cage. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom as the Metropolitan Police locked the main doors, their radios crackling sharply in the deathly quiet room. The vanguard soldiers standing in the center aisle drew their posture even straighter, their hands resting menacingly on the pommels of their broadswords. Lord Reginald Sterling, the billionaire husband of the vicious Lady Fiona, stood up violently, his chair crashing to the marble floor. He was a red-faced, blustering man accustomed to bullying prime ministers and skirting international laws. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Lord Sterling bellowed, his voice echoing off the frescoed ceiling. "Prince Angelo, we are guests in this country. You have no jurisdiction to trap British citizens like animals. I will have my lawyers strip your embassy down to the copper wiring." Angelo didn't even blink. He calmly took a sip of his water, carefully placed the crystal glass back on the table, and stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his midnight blue tuxedo and walked to the edge of the platform, looking down at Lord Sterling as one might look at a cockroach. "Jurisdiction, Lord Sterling, is a funny concept when it comes to international banking," Angelo said. His voice was amplified by the room's acoustics, carrying a lethal authority. "For the past 4 years, my intelligence agencies have been tracking the dark money that funded the attempted assassination of my father and the subsequent coup in Castile." Lord Sterling's ruddy face suddenly drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Beside him, Lady Fiona looked frantically between her husband and the approaching police officers, her silver gown trembling. "We followed the money through shell companies in Panama, through real estate holdings in Dubai, and finally, right back here, to London," Angelo continued, pacing slowly along the velvet rope. "To the supposedly respectable hedge funds and aristocratic estates sitting in this very room." Angelo snapped his fingers. Captain Hayes marched forward and handed the prince a thick, black leather dossier. "Lord Reginald Sterling of Sterling Holdings," Angelo read from the file, his voice echoing like thunder. "You authorized the transfer of £200 million to the mercenary faction known as the Black Vipers. You financed treason." "Lies!" Sterling screamed, though he was visibly shaking, sweat pouring down his forehead. "It's a fabrication." "Is it?" Angelo asked coldly. He flipped the page. "And what of Harrison Cole, head of Coalbridge Capital?" At table 88, Harrison Cole, who had spent the evening mocking Josephine's clothes and demanding her expulsion, tried to slide out of his chair and make a run for the side exit. 2 vanguard soldiers were on him before he took 3 steps, slamming him face first into the silk tablecloth of a neighboring table. The expensive crystal centerpieces shattered, raining glass over the floor. "Get your hands off me!" Harrison shrieked, his voice cracking in terror. "Coalbridge Capital," Angelo continued, ignoring the pathetic struggle, "laundered the blood money through your offshore accounts in exchange for a promised 30% stake in the Castilian lithium mines, contingent on my death." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Socialites screamed as police officers began moving through the tables, zip-tying the wrists of some of the most powerful men in Britain. The illusion of high society shattered instantly, revealing a den of thieves and murderers, dressed in bespoke tuxedos and designer gowns. Josephine sat at the royal table, watching the unbelievable scene unfold. The men who had ruled the world, the people who had sneered at her existence an hour ago, were being dismantled piece by piece. Angelo turned back to the crowd, his eyes finding the Kensington women who were huddled together, weeping hysterically as the police closed in on their table. "But the treason against my crown is only half of the crime," Angelo said, and the sheer fury in his voice commanded silence once again. He turned to look at Josephine, his expression softening momentarily before hardening back into steel. "The other half is a crime committed against the House of Harrington." Josephine's head snapped up. She stared at Angelo, her heart hammering. 80 years ago, Angelo projected his voice, the Harringtons sacrificed their own safety to protect my family's legacy. But 15 years ago, Josephine's grandfather did not simply lose his fortune in a bad investment, as the London gossip columns so gleefully reported. Angelo walked back over to Lord Sterling, who was currently being handcuffed by a metropolitan detective. Lord Sterling, along with Harrison Cole's father, orchestrated a hostile, illegal takeover of Harrington Enterprises, Angelo revealed, the truth dropping like a bomb into the room. They forged documents, bribed judges, and systematically drained the Harrington accounts dry. They stole her family's legacy, forced her into poverty, and then had the audacity to sit in this room tonight and mock her for wearing a dress that holds more honor than their entire bloodlines combined. Josephine let out a shuddering breath. The bankruptcy that had killed her grandfather from stress, the years of struggling, the eviction notices, the threadbare coats. It wasn't failure. It was theft. The people in this room had stolen her life. "No," Lady Fiona sobbed, clutching at the detective's arm as they hauled her husband away. "Please, Reginald, tell them it isn't true. Our money, our estates. What happens to our estates?" "Inumtishi, your estates," Angelo answered, looking down at Lady Fiona with absolute zero sympathy, "are currently being seized by the international courts. Every penny you stole from the Harringtons will be returned to them with interest. You are bankrupt, Lady Fiona. You are destitute. I suggest you get used to the taste of charity, though I doubt society will be as kind to you as you were to Miss Harrington tonight." Lady Fiona let out a harrowing shriek before collapsing onto the marble floor in a dead faint. Nobody rushed to help her. Harrison Cole was dragged out through the grand mahogany doors, crying like a child, his ruined backup jacket torn at the shoulder. Lord Sterling followed, his head bowed in absolute defeat. Within 10 minutes, 12 of London's most elite billionaires had been arrested, their reputations pulverized, their fortunes seized. The remaining guests sat in stunned, terrified silence, realizing that the hierarchy of power had just shifted permanently. They looked up at the royal table, not with sneers or judgment, but with sheer, unadulterated awe. Angelo turned away from the crowd and walked back up the steps to Josephine. He offered her his hand. "The rats have been cleared from the room," Angelo said softly, a gentle smile finally breaking through his royal facade. "Would you care to dance?" Josephine looked at Angelo's outstretched, white-gloved hand. The world around them was still reeling from the explosive arrests, the air thick with the metallic scent of fear and shattered crystal. Yet looking into Angelo's stormy, steadfast eyes, the chaos simply melted away. She wasn't the poor, humiliated book restorer anymore, and she wasn't the target of high society venom. She was the rightful heir to a stolen legacy. She placed her hand in his. The warmth of his grip anchored her, sending a jolt of electricity straight to her heart. "I would love to dance," Josephine said, her voice carrying a newfound, unshakable confidence. Angelo smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that transformed him from a ruthless monarch back into the man she had fallen in love with. He led her down the carpeted steps of the royal platform. Captain Hayes immediately snapped his fingers, pointing sharply at the terrified string quartet huddled in the corner of the grand stage. "Play," Hayes commanded, "a waltz, and play it perfectly." The lead cellist, his hands visibly shaking, hastily drew his bow across the strings. The violinists quickly followed, finding their rhythm in desperation. A sweeping, melancholic, and deeply romantic Viennese waltz filled the cavernous ballroom. Angelo led Josephine to the exact center of the marble floor, the very spot where Chloe Wentworth had shoved her, where Harrison Cole had screamed at her, where the entire room had circled her like a pack of starving wolves. Now the space was theirs alone. The 60 vanguard soldiers of the Royal Guard remained at attention, forming a formidable perimeter around the dance floor, their swords still drawn, ensuring that not a single soul dared to interrupt. Angelo placed one hand firmly on the small of Josephine's back and held her other hand aloft. As they began to move, the true magic of the 1926 Madeleine Vianney gown revealed itself. The dress, which the ignorant socialites had called shapeless, was a masterclass in the bias cut. As Josephine spun, the ancient emerald silk caught the air, transforming from a muted fabric into a cascading waterfall of liquid green light. It clung to her silhouette with flawless elegance, moving with a breathless, ethereal grace that modern, rigid couture could never hope to replicate. She looked like a queen stepping out of a forgotten painting. The remaining guests, those who hadn't been handcuffed and dragged out by the Metropolitan Police, sat frozen in their chairs, forced to witness the absolute triumph of the woman they had relentlessly mocked. Lady Eleanor Kensington, clutching her stained Givenchy gown, tried to quietly slide her chair back, desperately hoping to slip out through the service hallway and avoid the incoming financial audits she knew were coming for her own family. "Sit down, Lady Eleanor," Angelo said, his voice cutting through the sweeping music without him even turning his head to look at her. Eleanor froze, her face turning an ugly shade of ash white. She dropped heavily back into her chair, her daughter Beatrice softly weeping beside her. "You have excellent peripheral vision," Josephine whispered, a genuine laugh escaping her lips as Angelo spun her effortlessly across the polished floor. "When you spend 4 years hunting assassins, you learn to keep an eye on the rats," Angelo replied smoothly, pulling her closer. His gaze softened as he looked down at her. "But tonight, I only have eyes for you. You have carried the weight of the world on your shoulders, Josephine. You survived the theft of your family's empire with nothing but your own grit and dignity. You kept your heart pure in a city that tries to corrupt everything it touches." "It wasn't easy," she admitted softly, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. "There were days I thought the cold and the dust of that bookshop would bury me. And when you left, I thought I'd lost the only good thing that had ever happened to me." "You never lost me," Angelo vowed, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles as they danced. "And you will never know cold or hunger again. By tomorrow morning, the international courts will formally freeze the assets of the Sterling and Cole families. The Harrington estate, your grandfather's properties, the offshore accounts, everything they stole will be transferred directly back to your name, with 4 years of punitive interest." Josephine's breath caught. I don't even know how to run an empire." "You won't have to do it alone," Angelo said, his eyes burning with absolute certainty. "We will rebuild it together, if you'll have me." The waltz reached its sweeping crescendo. Angelo spun Josephine one final time before catching her gently by the waist. Dipping her slightly as the music soared and then slowly, beautifully faded into silence. For a moment, the ballroom was completely quiet. Then, the surviving billionaires and socialites, driven by a pathetic, desperate need to appease the crown prince and save their own skins, erupted into rapturous standing applause. They clapped until their hands turned red, forcing smiles onto their terrified faces, clapping for the very woman they had tried to throw into the rainy streets. An hour before, Angelo looked at the applauding crowd with utter disgust. He leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to Josephine's forehead. "Let's leave this graveyard," he whispered. The vanguard formed up instantly, creating a moving corridor of obsidian and steel. Angelo wrapped his arm protectively around Josephine's waist, and together they walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. They did not look back. They did not acknowledge the desperate, pleading bows of the elite, who scrambled to catch the prince's eye. Captain Hayes marched at the front, violently pushing open the towering mahogany doors. The scene outside Wellington House was a stark contrast to Josephine's lonely arrival. The rain had stopped, leaving the London streets slick and reflective under the street lamps. The massive courtyard, previously lined with Maybachs and Rolls-Royces, was now flashing with the harsh blue and red lights of dozens of police cruisers. To her left, Josephine watched as Harrison Cole, stripped of his bow tie and his arrogant smirk, was forcefully shoved into the back of a police van. Lord Reginald Sterling was screaming at a stoic detective, demanding his lawyer while his wrists were secured in heavy metal cuffs. Chloe Wentworth was sitting on the wet curb, her designer dress ruined, sobbing uncontrollably as an officer read her rights regarding fraud and assault. Beyond the police barricades, the paparazzi had multiplied by the hundreds. Rumors of the unprecedented raid at the Grand Sovereign Gala had spread through the city like wildfire, and every major news network in Europe had dispatched their top reporters to the scene. When Prince Angelo stepped out onto the grand stone steps with Josephine on his arm, the courtyard exploded into a blinding frenzy of camera flashes. The shouting of the reporters was a deafening roar. "Prince Angelo, is it true the Black Vipers were funded by London hedge funds? Your Highness, who is the woman in the green dress? Is it true the Sterling Empire is collapsing?" Captain Hayes moved to block the cameras, but Angelo raised a single hand. The commanding gesture, honed by years of ruling a recovering nation, demanded instant obedience. The shouting reporters immediately fell silent, their cameras still clicking frantically. Angelo stepped up to the closest cluster of microphones. He kept Josephine firmly by his side, his hand holding hers for the entire world to see. "Tonight, the House of Castile has severed the head of the serpent that attempted to destroy our nation." Angelo's voice boomed across the damp courtyard, clear and resolute. "Those who financed the treason against my father have been identified, arrested, and their assets seized. Justice has finally come to those who believed their wealth placed them above the law." He turned to look at Josephine, his expression softening for the cameras. "But justice was not the only thing I came to London to find. 15 years ago, the men arrested tonight orchestrated the illegal theft of the Harrington estate, a family that has served as the sworn protectors of the Castilian crown for generations." A collective gasp echoed from the press corps. The journalists furiously typed on their phones, the scandalous headline already writing itself. "I present to you," Angelo declared, raising Josephine's hand, "Lady Josephine Harrington, the rightful head of the Harrington Empire. She has survived poverty, betrayal, and the cruelty of a society that measures worth in currency rather than character. But her family's legacy is restored as of this hour. Furthermore, it is my absolute honor to announce that she has agreed to become my wife and the future Queen of Castile." The courtyard erupted into absolute pandemonium. The roar of the reporters, the blinding flashes, the sheer historical weight of the announcement. It was dizzying. Josephine stood tall, the vintage emerald V&A gown glowing under the harsh lights. She looked at the cameras, and then she looked down at the police vans. where the elites were trapped behind iron mesh. Oh, Chloe Wentworth, peering through the small window of a police cruiser, locked eyes with Josephine. Chloe's face crumpled in ultimate crushing defeat. Josephine didn't smile. She simply turned away, dismissing Chloe and the rest of the toxic society entirely. They were nothing but ghosts now. Angelo led her down the stone steps toward a waiting, bulletproof royal motorcade. Vanguard soldiers flanked the vehicle, opening the heavy armored door for them. Angelo helped her inside, and the door slammed shut, instantly cutting off the noise of the press and the sirens. The interior of the Maybach was warm, smelling of rich leather and cedar. As the motorcade pulled away from Wellington House, leaving the ruined billionaires to face their fate in the damp London night, Angelo reached into the interior pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a small, heavily tarnished silver box. "My operatives raided the Sterling estate an hour before we arrived at the gala," Angelo said softly, pressing a button to raise the privacy partition between them and the driver. He opened the silver box. Resting on a bed of black velvet was a heavy gold signet ring, deeply engraved with a roaring lion and a shield, the crest of the Harrington family. It was the ring Josephine's grandfather had worn every day of his life until he was forced to pawn it to keep a roof over their heads. Tears finally spilled over Josephine's eyelashes as she reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the heavy ring. It was cold to the touch, but it carried the weight of her ancestors, of her grandfather's love, and of her own survival. She slipped it onto her right index finger. It fit perfectly. "Your legacy, my lady," Angelo whispered, pulling her into his arms. Josephine rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong beat of his heart. Outside the tinted windows, the dark, rainy streets of London blurred past. She was leaving behind the drafty flat, the unpaid bills, and the sneering landlords forever. She had walked into the lion's den, dressed in a faded memory, and she had walked out a queen, ready to rule the world. What do you think will happen next when the royal guards storm the ballroom? Will the snobbish elite finally get the reality check they deserve? Or will they find a way to twist the situation? The shock on their faces is just the beginning of this incredible revenge. If you loved this dramatic twist and want to hear the rest of Josephine's triumphant story, you do not want to miss the next part. Hit that like button if you're rooting for Josephine. Share this story with someone who loves a good real-life underdog moment. And make sure to subscribe so you get notified the second the next chapter drops. Let us know in the comments how you would have handled these bullies.